The autumn of 1958 was the driest October in 22 years for the river bottom country west of Cedar Falls, Iowa, and by the third week of the month, the Farm Credit Administration had scheduled 41 foreclosure auctions across Black Hawk County alone. Cole Harlan stood at the back of the crowd on the morning of October 14th, one boot resting on the lower rail of the split cedar fence that bordered the Alderman property, and he watched the auctioneer climb the steps of the front porch of a farmhouse that did not belong to him. Harlan had been a marshal in Yuma County, Arizona for 21 years before the Bureau transferred him north on a federal fraud case that had wound through 3 states and ended, 6 weeks earlier, in a Des Moines courtroom with a guilty verdict and a man named Rudolph Kessler being led out in leg irons. The case was closed. Harlan's train south left tomorrow evening. He had nothing to do in Iowa except wait, and so he walked. And on the morning of October 14th, his walking had brought him down the gravel county road past the white mailbox with Alderman painted on it in black letters. And he had stopped because a crowd of 40-some people gathered around a farmhouse on a Tuesday morning meant something specific, and Harlan had spent 20 years reading what crowds meant. He pulled his coat collar up against the wind coming off the cornfields. The stalks had already been cut and the ground was bare, gray-brown in the October light, extending east to a tree line of cottonwood and ash that had gone yellow and were starting to shed. The farmhouse was white clapboard with green shutters, 2 stories, a covered porch across the front, a stone foundation that someone had pointed with mortar sometime in the last decade. Behind it stood a red bank barn and a machine shed of newer construction, sheet metal sided. Between the barn and the house, a kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, the tomato cages stacked and leaning against the chicken wire fence, the rows mulched with straw. Someone had taken care of this place. That was visible from the road. That was the first thing Harlan noticed. The second thing he noticed was the woman standing on the near side of the crowd, slightly apart from it, in a brown wool coat with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes fixed on the porch where the auctioneer was arranging his papers. She was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had learned not to show everything it felt. She was not crying. She was watching. Harlan had seen that particular expression on the faces of people who had already exhausted their alternatives and were now simply present for the thing they could not stop. Her name was Ruth Alderman. The farmhouse behind the auctioneer had been her home for 16 years. The land it sat on, 112 acres of Black Hawk County bottomland, had been her husband's family's land for 43 years before that. The corn planted in the east field every spring since 1915 had fed the family through 2 wars and a depression, and the money it made had built the machine shed in 1951 and paid for Ruth's youngest daughter to have her appendix removed in Waterloo in the summer of 1953 without going into debt. The Aldermans had never been wealthy, but they had never owed more than they could service. Not until the spring of 1956, when Ruth's husband, Donald Alderman, went out to the machine shed on a March afternoon to service the John Deere and did not come back for dinner, and Ruth found him there at 6:30, beside the tractor, gone from a heart attack at the age of 47. Cole Harlan did not know any of this yet. He knew only what the crowd and the auctioneer and the woman's face told him, which was enough to keep his boot on the fence rail for the next 10 minutes while the auction began. Ruth Alderman had come to Iowa as Ruth Pelletier, born in 1918 in a small town called Olwayne, 40 miles northeast of Cedar Falls, the second of 4 children of a railroad switchman named Gerard Pelletier and his wife, Marguerite, who had come to Iowa from Quebec province in 1911 and never quite stopped missing the St. Lawrence. Ruth grew up in a house where French was spoken at dinner and English everywhere else, where money was counted carefully and wasted on nothing, where her father worked the B&O Railroad 6 days a week, and her mother kept a kitchen garden and canned enough tomatoes every August to last through March. She was not a romantic girl. She was practical in the way that children of practical people become practical, not from philosophy but from observation. She met Donald Alderman at a church social in the summer of 1938, when she was 20 and he was 25, and already farming his father's land outside Cedar Falls. Donald was a quiet man, broad across the shoulders, with large hands and a deliberate way of speaking that Ruth initially mistook for slowness and later understood was simply the habit of a man who thought before he talked. They were married in May of 1940 at St. Patrick's in Olvine, with Ruth's father and Donald's father both in the front pew, and they moved to the Alderman place that same summer. The land was 112 acres, as it had been since Donald's father, Henry Alderman, filed the original deed in 1915. The east field was 80 acres of flat bottomland, fed by a seasonal draw that ran from the county road all the way to the cottonwood line. It was good corn ground, dark, loamy soil with the kind of moisture retention that made it worth something in a dry year, and worth more in a wet one. The west field, behind the barn, was 32 acres of slightly higher ground that Donald rotated between corn and soybeans on a 2-year cycle. He knew what he was doing. His father had taught him the ground the way some fathers teach their children music, note by note, season by season, with patience and without shortcuts. Ruth and Donald had 3 children. The eldest, a son named James, was born in 1941. Then came a daughter, Carol, in 1944. Then the youngest, Patricia, in 1950. James helped his father from the time he was old enough to sit on a tractor seat, and by the time he was 16 he could run the planting operation from start to finish with only occasional guidance. Carol was bookish and quiet, and won a scholarship to the University of Iowa in 1962, which was still 4 years away when the trouble began. Patricia, Patty, as everyone called her, was 8 years old in October of 1958, small and dark-haired like her mother, and she was the one who had her appendix out in 1953, and who everyone agreed was the most like Ruth, watchful, precise, not easily frightened. When Donald died in March of 1956, James was 14, Carol was 11, and Patty was 5. Ruth was 37 years old, and she owned 112 acres of bottomland, a 2-story farmhouse in good repair, a red bank barn, a machine shed, a John Deere Model 60 row crop tractor, a 1952 farmall for lighter work, a grain auger, a corn picker, and a 4-year-old Chevrolet pickup that still ran well. She also owed First National Bank of Cedar Falls a note of $4,200, taken out in 1954 to finance the machine shed, at 6% per annum, with a monthly payment of $71. The note was manageable when Donald was alive and farming the ground. It was not manageable when a 37-year-old widow was trying to plant and harvest 112 acres with a 14-year-old son, hire labor she could not easily afford, and maintain equipment that did not care who had died or when. She made the note payments through 1956, every one of them, because she had never missed a payment on anything in her life, and she was not going to start. She made the payments through 1957, though the corn price dropped that year, and the yield on the east field was lighter than expected after a dry August. She made the January and February payments of 1958. In March of 1958, exactly 2 years after Donald's death, the water pump on the John Deere failed at the beginning of planting season, and the repair cost was $260. She made the March note payment and did not have the money for the pump repair. She borrowed $300 from her brother-in-law in Waterloo, had the pump repaired, planted the east field on time, and told her brother-in-law she would repay him by November 1st. The summer of 1958 was the dry summer. The east field yielded 41 bushels to the acre where it typically yielded 54. The corn price at the Cedar Falls elevator in October was $1.06 per bushel. Ruth sold the harvest and paid the note payments for the months she had missed, April, May, June, July, and paid her brother-in-law back, and did not have enough left to make the August, September, or October payments. The total she owed First National Bank of Cedar Falls, in back payments and accumulated penalties, and the remaining principal on the original note, was $2,987. She did not have it. First National Bank of Cedar Falls was not a malicious institution. It was a prosperous one. Its president in 1958 was a man named Harlan Brecht, no relation to Cole Harlan, just the coincidence of a name, who had run the bank since 1944 and who was known in the county as a careful and conservative man who did not extend credit easily and who did not forgive it easily either. Brecht was 61 years old, trim, with wire-rimmed glasses and the contained manner of a man who had seen the 1930s and concluded that the primary danger in banking was sentiment. He was not cruel. He had extended forbearance to several farmers in the county over the years, including one man in 1952 who was 3 months behind, and who Brecht gave an additional 90 days, because the man's situation appeared temporary and recoverable. Ruth Alderman's situation did not appear temporary and recoverable. It appeared structural. A widow with 3 children, a 14-year-old son as her primary labor, and a note she had been struggling to service for 2 years was, in Brecht's assessment, a situation that would not improve on its own. He had seen this pattern. In 1949, a widow named Esther Conley had fallen behind on a similar note, and Brecht had extended her 2 extra months, and she had still been unable to pay, and the bank had foreclosed in January of 1950 and lost money in the process because the property sold at auction for less than the note balance. He did not intend to repeat that outcome. Ruth received the first formal notice of default in September of 1958. It was a typed letter on bank letterhead, formal and correct in all its language, advising her that the note was in arrears and that the bank would be required to initiate foreclosure proceedings if the delinquent balance was not retired within 30 days. The delinquent balance at that point was $1,422. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, alone, after the children were in bed. Then she drove to Cedar Falls the next morning and asked to see Brecht. His secretary, a woman named Dolores Marsh who had worked at the bank for 11 years and who was neither unkind nor particularly kind, told Ruth that Mr. Brecht was available for a 15-minute appointment on Wednesday of the following week. Ruth said she would take it. She sat across from Brecht's desk on that Wednesday and explained her situation without embellishment. She told him what the harvest had yielded, what the corn had sold for, what she had spent and what she owed. She told him that James would be old enough to take over the full operation in 2 more years, and that she needed only to hold the note until the farm was fully productive again. Brecht listened. He was not dismissive. He told her that the bank's policy did not permit him to extend additional forbearance beyond what had already been implicitly granted by the lack of formal action until September. He told her the 30-day window was the limit of what he could offer. He expressed in the careful language of a bank president that he was sorry for her circumstances. Ruth drove home in the Chevrolet pickup and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. She tried 3 other doors. She went to the Black Hawk County Farm Bureau and spoke with their representative, a man named Tom Vogt, who was sympathetic and told her about a federal loan program through the Farmers Home Administration that might be applicable but would take 60 to 90 days to process, longer than her 30-day window. She wrote a letter to her state representative in Des Moines. The letter was answered 12 days later by a staff member who provided a list of agencies that might be of assistance, none of which she had not already contacted. She went to the Cedar Falls Savings and Loan and asked about refinancing the note. The loan officer, a young man named Gary Wilkie, reviewed her financial statement and told her that without a co-signer with substantial assets, The savings and loan could not approve a new loan to retire the First National note. She asked if she could have 2 or 3 days to find a co-signer. He said yes. She could not find one in 2 days. Her brother-in-law had already lent her the $300 and had his own farm expenses to manage. Her parents were retired and had very little. Her sister in Ovine was married to a school teacher and could not co-sign a note of nearly $3,000. After 48 hours, she went back to Gary Wilkie and told him she had not been able to find a co-signer. He told her he was sorry. The 30 days expired. First National Bank of Cedar Falls filed the foreclosure action with the Black Hawk County Clerk's Office on October 2, 1958. The auction was scheduled for October 14th at 9 o'clock in the morning on the property. Ruth received the auction notice by certified mail on October 4th. She signed for it at the mailbox and carried it into the house and set it on the kitchen table and stood there for a long time with her hand on the paper before she went to find her children. She did not tell James and Carol what the notice meant, not immediately. She told them there would be some people at the house on the 14th. She told Patty nothing, because Patty was 8 and there was nothing to tell an 8-year-old that would not simply frighten her. Ruth had not slept well since March of 1956, and she had not slept at all in the 5 days since the auction notice arrived. Cole Harlan had come to the Alderman property by accident, which was the way most things in his life had come to him. His jurisdictional authority as a federal marshal did not extend to civil foreclosure actions in the state of Iowa. He was here only because his walking took him here, and because the crowd meant something, and because he had, as a habit of 20 years, an instinct for situations that were not right. Harlan had grown up on the line between two worlds. His mother was Aravaipa Apache, a woman named Na Lin who had survived the Camp Grant massacre of 1871 as a child, and who spent the years that followed moving quietly through southern Arizona, working when she could, visible as little as possible to the white settlements that regarded her with suspicion or indifference. His father was Thomas Harlan, an Anglo freighter from West Texas, who met Na Lin at a trading post outside Tucson in 1869. Before the massacre, and who married her in a ceremony that Arizona Territory's legal apparatus did not recognize, but that both of them observed as binding and permanent. Thomas Harlan was a hard-working man with a strict ethical code and no political ambitions whatsoever. He had looked at his mixed-blood son and made a decision. Cole would be educated, would learn both his parents' languages, and would be given every possible skill for navigating a world that would be unkind to him regardless of which direction he faced. Harlan had taken the deputy marshal's position at 24 because it was offered by a man who was fair-minded, and because it provided a legitimate structure for the thing he was already doing, which was intervening, at personal risk and at his own judgment, in situations that were not right. By the time he was made full marshal at 31, he had the reputation of a man who was not easily provoked and not easily stopped. In Yuma County, they told a story about him and a cattle baron named Greer, who had been running a land seizure scheme through a series of fraudulent water rights claims. Harlan had dismantled the scheme through a combination of legal documentation and 2 conversations with Greer that no one had witnessed. Greer had quietly withdrawn from 3 pending land claims and left the county 8 months later. Harlan had never explained what was said in those conversations, and no one had asked him directly, because the expression on his face when the subject came up made the question seem inadvisable. He was 44 years old in October of 1958. He had been in Iowa for 6 weeks, and it felt like 6 years. The flat, gray sky country, so unlike the desert he knew, had a particular quality of light in the autumn that he found unexpectedly affecting, wide and clear and honest, without the drama of the Southwest, but with a kind of plain-spoken grandeur. He had walked a great deal since the Kessler verdict, partly to fill the waiting time and partly because movement helped him think, and he had several things to think about. including whether he was going to accept the Bureau's offer of a regional supervisor position out of Phoenix that would mostly mean a desk and a telephone and other men's problems. He was standing at the fence on the morning of October 14th, thinking about none of that, because what was in front of him was sufficient. He watched the auctioneer, a county employee named Vernon Hark, read the legal description of the property from a printed form. He watched the bidders, 11 men, most of them strangers to one another, some of them with the careful eyes of land speculators, and some of them clearly neighbors of the aldermans who had come partly out of morbid solidarity and partly because land in Black Hawk County was land worth watching for. He watched the woman in the brown wool coat, Ruth Alderman, standing apart from the crowd with her arms folded and her face controlled. He asked the man next to him, a heavy-set farmer in a canvas jacket named Walt Feuerbach, who turned out to be the alderman's neighbor on the North Quarter section, what the situation was. Feuerbach told him. He told him about the note and the drought year and Donald Alderman's death 2 years back and Ruth's 3 children and the 30 days and the bank. He told him the bank was owed just under $3,000 and that the property, the house, the barn, the machine shed, and the 112 acres would go to whoever bid the highest, and that the bank would take what it was owed, and if there was anything over that amount, it would go to Ruth Alderman to start over with. Feuerbach said he did not know where Ruth would go or what she would do. Harlan asked how much the land alone was worth. Feuerbach said good bottomland in Black Hawk County was going for $80 to $120 an acre in a normal year. He said in a foreclosure auction the bidders would go low if they could, because that was the nature of foreclosure auctions. You did not pay what a thing was worth when the seller had no choice. He said he expected the property to go for somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000. Harlan nodded and said nothing. He stood at the fence for another 4 minutes while Vernon Hark opened the bidding at $5,000, and the first 3 bids came in rapid succession, $5,000, $5,500, $6,000, from men Harlan did not know. Then he pushed off the fence and walked through the crowd toward the front porch. Nobody in the crowd moved as Harlan came through it. They stepped back without being asked, the way people step back for a man who moves with a particular kind of certainty. He was lean and dark-faced in his gray coat, unhurried, with the deliberate stride of a man who had decided something and was now simply executing the decision. He came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped there while Vernon Hark, mid-sentence, registered his presence and lost the thread of what he was saying. Harlan reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced his federal marshal's identification, not because it was relevant to what he was about to do, but because it established clearly what kind of man he was and what kind of weight his presence carried. He held it up briefly and then put it away. He said, in a voice that carried without being raised, that he would like a 15-minute recess before the bidding continued. Vernon Hark said that foreclosure auctions conducted under Iowa state law did not permit recesses once bidding had commenced. Harlan said he understood that. He said he was not asking Hark to stop the auction. He was asking Hark to grant him 15 minutes as a courtesy before continuing, and that the county attorney's office, which supervised the conduct of foreclosure auctions in Black Hawk County, would likely take a favorable view of any courtesy extended to a sitting federal officer. Hark looked at Harlan for a moment. Then he looked at the crowd. Then he looked at his watch and said he would allow 10 minutes. Harlan turned away from the porch and walked back through the crowd to the gravel driveway at the side of the house. The crowd watched him. Ruth Alderman had turned toward him. She had watched the whole exchange from 20 feet away. And now she was looking at him with an expression that was neither hope nor suspicion, but a kind of wary attention, the look of a woman who has been given enough false signals in the last 30 days that she does not intend to act on any signal until she understands its source. Harlan walked up to her and introduced himself by name. He told her he was a federal marshal. that his case here was concluded, and that he had nothing to do with the bank or the county court system or this auction in any official capacity. He told her that what he was about to do had nothing to do with his badge and was a private matter, and that she should understand that. He asked her if the figure Walt Feuerbach had given him was correct, if the total owed to First National Bank of Cedar Falls, including all back payments and penalties and the remaining principal, was $2,987. Ruth said yes. She said it quietly and without inflection, the way a person states a fact they have memorized against their will. Harlan reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a personal check. He had already written it. In the 45 seconds he was out of Ruth's line of sight when he walked to the driveway, he had filled in the amount and the payee using the pen he carried in his left breast pocket, a habit from 20 years of paperwork at inconvenient moments. The check was from a Wells Fargo account in his name, drawn on a Phoenix branch, in the amount of $2,987, made out to First National Bank of Cedar Falls. He held it out to her. Ruth looked at the check. She did not take it immediately. She looked at his face. He told her it was not a loan. He said that clearly and without elaboration. He said he had spoken to enough people in the past decade who tried to give people money as loans when they meant to give it as gifts, and that the distinction mattered, and he was making it now. He said there was no repayment expected, and no interest, and no obligation of any kind. He said she should take it to the bank president. He believed the man's name was Brecht, and have Brecht apply it to the note balance, and provide written confirmation that the note was retired in full, and she should have that confirmation in her hand before the auction was legally required to resume. Ruth said, "I don't know you." Harlan said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Why would you do this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that a man who died fixing a tractor left behind people who deserved better than a county auction on a Tuesday morning. He said it without sentiment, as a statement of fact. Ruth Alderman took the check. Nobody in that crowd had moved during this exchange, because the crowd had positioned itself, without conscious coordination, to see and hear every word. Walt Feuerbach was standing at the left side of the driveway with his cap in his hands. A younger man named Dale Mischke, who farmed 2 miles south and had come because he could not come, was standing 3 feet behind Feuerbach with the expression of a man watching something he will spend the next 40 years trying to describe accurately. Vernon Hark had come down off the porch and was standing at the porch rail. A woman named Irene Schuster, who was the alderman's nearest neighbor to the south, and who had brought Ruth a casserole the day the auction notice arrived, was standing with her hands pressed flat together in front of her mouth. Harlan turned to the crowd and said, in the same carrying voice he had used with Hark, that there would be a short drive to town, and that the auction would be paused pending resolution of the underlying debt. He said he believed Vernon Hark would confirm that if the note was retired before the auction concluded, the auction had no legal basis to proceed. Hark said that was correct. Ruth drove to Cedar Falls in the Chevrolet pickup. Harlan followed in the black Ford sedan he had rented from a lot near the Waterloo Airport. The drive was 14 miles and took 22 minutes on the county roads. Ruth drove at a deliberate pace, and Harlan drove behind her without crowding her, and the 2 vehicles made their way through the pale October countryside with the bare cornfields on either side, going gray and brown all the way to the horizon. Harlan Brecht's secretary, Dolores Marsh, looked up from her desk when Ruth Alderman and Cole Harlan came through the bank's glass front door and said, in the carefully neutral voice she had cultivated through 11 years of working at the front of a bank, that she would see if Mr. Brecht was available. She returned in under 2 minutes and showed them both through. Brecht was behind his desk. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Harlan. He looked at the marshal's identification Harlan produced a second time. He did not say very much. He was the kind of man who collected information before he reacted. Harlan laid the check on Brecht's desk and said the amount was $2,987 and that he was presenting it in full retirement of the outstanding note held by the bank in the name of Donald and Ruth Alderman against the property at the county road address. He said he wanted a receipt marked paid in full, a formal letter confirming that the mortgage note was retired and the lien released, and a verbal confirmation from Brecht that the foreclosure auction scheduled for that morning would be immediately suspended. Brecht picked up the check and examined it. He looked at the account number. He looked at the amount. He looked at Harlan. He said that a personal check required time to clear, and that until it cleared, the bank could not legally confirm retirement of the note. Harlan said he understood that. He said he would wait while Brecht called the Wells Fargo branch manager in Phoenix on the telephone and confirmed that the funds were available and that the check was genuine. He said the branch manager's name was Robert Alcott and that Alcott was in his office on weekday mornings. There was a silence in Harlan Brecht's office that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Brecht picked up his telephone and asked Dolores to get him a long-distance line to Phoenix, Arizona. He waited. The call went through. He spoke for 3 minutes with a man who was evidently Robert Alcott at Wells Fargo, Phoenix, and at the end of those 3 minutes, Brecht thanked the man and hung up the telephone and set it back in its cradle and looked at the check in his other hand and set it down on the desk blotter. He said the funds were confirmed available. He said he would have the documentation prepared within the hour. Harlan said he would wait in the lobby. He stood up. Ruth had been sitting in the chair beside him during all of this, and she had said nothing, because there was nothing for her to say and she was smart enough to know it. Harlan spent 55 minutes in a chair in the lobby of First National Bank of Cedar Falls. He read the Cedar Falls Gazette, which he had picked up from the stack on the lobby table, and drank the coffee that Dolores Marsh brought him without being asked, which was the first indication that Dolores Marsh was a more complex person than her careful neutrality suggested. At 12 minutes after noon, Harlan Brecht's secretary brought out a sealed envelope addressed to Ruth Alderman and a single page on bank letterhead, signed by Brecht himself, confirming that the mortgage note executed by Donald and Ruth Alderman in February of 1954 was retired in full as of October 14, 1958, and that the lien on the property was hereby released, and that the foreclosure action filed with the Black Hawk County Clerk's Office on October 2, 1958, would be withdrawn by the bank the following business day. Ruth held the paper in both hands. She read it twice. Her face, which had been held in that controlled and careful stillness for at least the last 30 days, and probably longer, did not change dramatically, but something behind her eyes changed. Harlan had seen that particular change before. It was not relief. Relief was too simple a word for what crossed a person's face when the thing they had been bracing for was suddenly, irrevocably, not going to happen. She looked at him. She said, "How do I repay this?" He said, "You don't." She said his name would be on the canceled check. She said she could find him. He said she could. He said he would appreciate it if she didn't. He did not wait for an answer. He shook Brecht's hand in the lobby. Brecht had come out himself for that, which said something, and walked out through the glass door into the October afternoon. The wind off the fields had come up while they were inside, and the elm trees that lined the main street of Cedar Falls were moving in it, yellow leaves coming loose in small bursts and skipping across the sidewalk. Harlan stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his coat collar up, looking at the street, and then he walked to the Ford sedan and got in and drove back toward his hotel in Waterloo. He did not drive past the Alderman property. He took the state route north, which did not pass it. Ruth Alderman drove back to her farm at noon on October 14, 1958. She drove down the county road and turned into her own driveway past the mailbox with her name on it, and she parked the Chevrolet pickup in its usual place and sat in it for a moment before she got out. Vernon Hark's county vehicle was gone. The crowd was gone. The driveway was empty and the front porch was empty, and the farm sat in the pale afternoon light exactly as it had sat on every other afternoon she had come home to it for 16 years. The red barn, the machine shed, the kitchen garden in its winter mulch, the cornfields cut and bare and waiting for spring. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the bank's letter in front of her. James and Carol were in school. Patty was in school. She would have to tell them something when they came home, but she was not yet sure what the right words were. She had been so concentrated for so many weeks on the approaching worst outcome that she had given almost no thought to the possibility of a different outcome. And the different outcome had arrived so suddenly and so completely that she was not sure yet how to hold it. Irene Schuster came over at 2 o'clock. She had clearly been watching for Ruth's truck to come back. She came with a coffee cake she had baked that morning. She had not known what else to do with herself while the auction was proceeding, and she sat across the kitchen table from Ruth, and Ruth told her everything that had happened, and Irene Schuster listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made her a good neighbor. When Ruth finished, Irene was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Who is he?" Ruth said he was a federal marshal from Arizona who was here for a case and was leaving tomorrow. Irene said, "Does he have any more checks?" Ruth laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since March. Walt Feuerbach came by at 4 o'clock and shook Ruth's hand without saying much, because Walt Feuerbach expressed what he felt through the fact of his presence rather than through language, and Ruth understood that and thanked him for coming. Dale Mischke stopped in at 4:30 and said he did not know what to say, and said it for about 5 minutes straight, which was his particular gift. When James and Carol came home on the school bus, Ruth sat them both at the kitchen table and told them what had happened. She told them about the note and the auction and the 30 days in a level voice, saying all the things she had protected them from knowing, and then she told them what Cole Harlan had done. James, who was 17 and understood enough about money and farming to understand fully what his mother had just told him, put both elbows on the table and covered his face with his hands for a long moment. Carol sat very still. James said, "Who was he?" Ruth said his name and that he was a marshal from Arizona and that he was leaving tomorrow. James said they had to find him. He said they had to go to Waterloo tonight and find his hotel and thank him properly. Ruth said no. James said, "Ma, we have to." Ruth said the man had told her clearly what he wanted, and that what he wanted was for them to live on their farm and not to look for him. She said honoring a kindness sometimes meant doing exactly what the person who gave it asked you to do, and that what Cole Harlan had asked was to be left alone. She said James would understand that better when he was older. James sat with that for a while. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." That night Ruth put Patty to bed at 7:30 and sat with her for a few extra minutes, the way she did when something had happened that she could not yet explain to an 8-year-old. Patty asked if people were going to take their house. Ruth said no. She said the house was theirs and was going to stay theirs. Patty said, "Okay," in the way that children accept reassurances that they have been anxious about for weeks, and was asleep by 7:45. Ruth Alderman slept for 8 uninterrupted hours that night for the first time in longer than she could remember. Cole Harlan's train left Waterloo at 6:15 the following evening. He spent his last day in Iowa the way he had spent most of the others, walking, thinking, eating at a counter diner off the main street where the coffee was serviceable and the pie was excellent, and no one asked him anything. He thought about Ruth Alderman's farm and about what it took to keep a thing alive for 16 years in difficult country. He thought about what it would have looked like in another 10 years if the auction had gone the way it was scheduled to go. He thought about the bank letter in her hands at the table in Breck's office and the particular change behind her eyes. He thought about the Bureau's offer of the desk in Phoenix. He thought about it for most of the afternoon walk, and by the time he came back to the hotel to collect his bag, he had reached a conclusion, which was that he was not yet done with the kind of work that put him in difficult country at the end of a gun rather than behind a desk with a telephone. He had at least another few years in him of the kind of work where decisions were made in real time, with imperfect information, and the outcome depended on whether the man making the decision had read the situation correctly. He would decline the Phoenix offer. He would write that letter tonight on the train. He checked out at 5 o'clock and drove the rental car to the Waterloo depot and sat on a platform bench in the October cold with his bag at his feet and watched the pigeons on the depot roof until his train came. He did not look south toward Cedar Falls. There was nothing to see in that direction from this bench anyway, just the flat Iowa sky going orange and gray in the evening, the kind of sky that had no drama in it, just a plain declaration that the day was ending and the next one would come. He got on the train and went home. In the spring of 1959, 6 months after the October morning that had changed everything, Ruth Alderman planted the East Field on time for the first time in 2 years. She had a hired man now, a neighbor's son named Roy Guth, 19 years old, strong and willing, who agreed to work 4 days a week through planting and harvest for 50 cents an hour plus lunch. James was 18 that spring, and capable of running the John Deere through an entire field day without supervision. Together they planted 51 acres of corn on the east field and 28 acres of soybeans on the west, with the remaining acreage in the rotation left fallow. The summer of 1959 was a good summer. The seasonal draw ran adequately from May through July, and the corn grew well. The beans did better than expected. Ruth sold the corn harvest in October at $1.11 per bushel, 5 cents better than the previous year, and the bean harvest brought additional income that she had not fully projected. When she had the numbers in front of her in November, she sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pencil and did the arithmetic the way her father had taught her, slowly and without rounding, and what the arithmetic told her was that the farm had run in the black for the first time since Donald's death. Not richly in the black, not comfortably so, but clearly so. The column on the right side was larger than the column on the left side by $412. She folded the legal pad and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept the farm's documents. By the fall of 1960, the operation had found its rhythm. James was managing the East Field almost entirely on his own, with Roy Guth as a reliable second hand. Carol had her scholarship to the University of Iowa confirmed and would start the following September. Patty was 9 and growing into her mother's precision, and she had taken it upon herself to maintain the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that exceeded what anyone had asked of her, extending it by 3 rows and adding a small cold frame for late-season lettuce. Ruth had expanded the operation slightly, renting 14 additional acres from the Feuerbach farm to the north at $8 per acre per season, which increased the East Field's corn base and improved the overall economics of the rotation. The corn yield in 1960 was 56 bushels to the acre on the East Field, 2 bushels better than the best year Donald had seen in the late 1940s. When Walt Feuerbach came to collect his rent for the extra 14 acres, and Ruth handed him the cash, $112 exact, he took it and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and said, "You've got this sorted, Ruth." She said she believed she did. Dale Mischke, who had stood in the driveway on the morning of the auction with the expression of a man witnessing something he would try to describe for 40 years, had in fact been changed by what he witnessed. He was 26 years old in October of 1958 and was 3 years into farming his family's place south of the Alderman property, and he had watched Cole Harlan produce that check at the foot of the porch steps and hand it to a widow he had never met, and the plain matter-of-factness of the act had stayed with him. In the spring of 1959, when he learned that a family named Kolb 2 miles north was facing a similar situation, a sick husband, a missed payment, a 60-day notice, Dale Mischke drove over and lent them $500 out of his own savings at no interest. with repayment when possible, and no schedule attached. He did not announce this. He told his wife and no one else. The Kolbs repaid him in 1961, which he had not expected but was glad of. He could not have said, if pressed, exactly why he had done it, but he would have said it had something to do with a federal marshal from Arizona, standing in a driveway in October, with a personal check and a plain manner. By 1963, the Alderman farm was running well enough that Ruth was able to make a small improvement to the machine shed, replacing the sheet metal sliding door that had been difficult since 1955, with a proper hinge door and new hardware. It was not a large expenditure. It was the kind of expenditure that a farm makes when it is healthy. She wrote a check from the farm account for $68.20 and handed it to the hardware man in Cedar Falls, with a feeling that was harder to name than satisfaction, something more like confirmation. James Alderman took over the primary operation in 1964, when Ruth was 45 and had begun to think about what the farm would look like in the next generation. He was 23 that year, married to a woman named Beverly Krug from Grundy County, and they were living in the farmhouse with Ruth while they saved for a down payment on a place of their own. James was a better farmer than his father had been, not more dedicated but technically more sophisticated, making use of the new Extension Service recommendations on fertilizer application and hybrid seed varieties that Donald, who had trusted the old methods, had been reluctant to adopt. Under James, the East Field's yield rose to 62 bushels per acre in 1965 and 67 in 1966. Carol Alderman graduated from the University of Iowa in 1966 with a degree in education and went to teach 6th grade in Iowa City, where she eventually became the principal of Jefferson Elementary School. She visited the farm every Thanksgiving and every other summer for the rest of her life. Patty Alderman finished high school in Cedar Falls in 1968 and went to Iowa State for 2 years before marrying a man named Robert Klein who farmed in Tama County, and she raised 4 children there in a farmhouse that, everyone in the family noted, she kept with the same precision she had brought to the kitchen garden on the home place. Ruth Alderman lived in the farmhouse she had been on the verge of losing until 1979, when she was 61, and her knees made the stairs difficult, and James and Beverly built her a small house 50 yards from the barn, on the near edge of the kitchen garden plot, with 1 story and a wide front porch that looked out over the east field. She moved into it in the spring of 1980 and sat on its porch on the morning of May 12th with a cup of coffee and watched James start the spring planting on the east field with a tractor that was newer than any Donald had ever owned. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about a man in a gray coat standing at the foot of a porch she had been about to lose, and holding out a piece of paper with no strings attached. She had thought about finding him many times over the years. She knew his name. She knew he had been a federal marshal operating out of Yuma County, Arizona. James had, at the age of 19, written a letter to the federal marshal's office in Arizona, asking how to reach Cole Harlan. The letter was answered 4 months later by a clerk who confirmed that a marshal by that name had served in Yuma County, but was no longer with that office, and that no forwarding information was available. Ruth had not pursued it further. The man had told her what he wanted, and she had made James understand that honoring a kindness meant honoring the terms of it. But she kept the bank letter. She had kept it from the day it was placed in her hands in Breck's outer office. It was in a manila envelope in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where she had put the yellow legal pad with the first positive accounting in 1959. The envelope held the bank letter confirming retirement of the mortgage note and a photocopy of the canceled check that the bank had returned to her at year-end as part of the standard account documentation. The canceled check bore Cole Harlan's signature in blue ink, a plain, compact signature, no flourishes, and on its face was the Wells Fargo account number and the amount, $2,987, and the date, October 14, 1958, and his name printed above the account number, C.E. Harlan, Marshal, U.S. Federal Service. Ruth put the manila envelope in the kitchen drawer in 1958 and moved it, when she moved to her small house in 1980, to the equivalent drawer in the equivalent kitchen, and it sat there through all the years that followed, not displayed, not hidden, simply present, the way certain things are kept not for display but because the keeping of them is its own kind of record. James Alderman knew the story in full. Beverly knew it. Their 3 children, Donald, named for his grandfather, and Eileen, and Ruth, named for her grandmother, knew a version of it that had been refined over years of telling into something like a family text. What the family text emphasized, when they told it to the children, was not the money, though the children understood the money, but the manner of it. The way the man had said it was not a loan, the way he had declined to be thanked, the way he had not driven back past the farm. By the late 1980s, the Alderman farm was 140 acres, the Feuerbach rental acres having been formally purchased by James in 1971, when Walt Feuerbach sold off his outer parcels before retirement. The east field yielded consistently above county average. The farmhouse had a new roof put on in 1984. The red bank barn was repainted in 1987 by Donald Alderman, James's eldest son, then 21, who mixed the paint himself to get the color right, and who told his grandmother, visiting from her small house nearby, that he thought the barn looked the way it should. Ruth, who was 70 that year, looked at the barn and said yes. Cole Harlan had left the marshal's service in 1968, at the age of 54, after 29 years. He had declined the Phoenix desk more than once in those years, and had eventually been offered, and accepted, a quieter role as a federal investigator in New Mexico, working out of Albuquerque on fraud and civil rights cases through the 1960s. The civil rights cases had been the hardest work of his life, and the most important, and he had done them without drama in the way he had always done things, with the minimum force available and the maximum attention to what was in front of him. He retired to a small house in Taos, New Mexico, and lived there until 1981, when he died of a stroke at the age of 67. He was buried in a cemetery outside Taos, in a section that overlooked the high desert to the south, which was the country he had known first. He had never married. He had no children. The Marshal's Service obituary, filed in the Albuquerque Journal in January of 1981, was 4 paragraphs, and listed his years of service and his major cases, and noted that he was of Apache and Anglo descent, and that he had served with distinction in 3 federal districts. It did not mention Iowa. There was no reason it would. What happened in Black Hawk County on October 14, 1958, was not a case and was not official business. It was a man at the right end of his walking who saw something and decided. In the summer of 1991, Carol Alderman, then 67, retired from Jefferson Elementary School, visiting the farm for the summer, found the manila envelope in her mother's kitchen drawer while looking for a pen. Ruth was 83 and in the small house still, slower now but precise in her movements and clear in her thinking, the way certain people are clear at the end. Carol sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope and read the bank letter and looked at the canceled check. She had known the story for 33 years, but she had not, until that moment, held the physical check. She looked at the signature. She looked at the amount, printed in the machine type of a 1958 personal check in the amount of $2,987. She looked at her mother. Ruth was at the kitchen counter, making coffee. Carol said, "Ma, did you ever find out what happened to him?" Ruth said he had died in New Mexico in 1981. She said James had seen a notice somewhere years after and had told her. Carol said, "Did you write to anyone? Did you send a letter?" Ruth said, "He didn't want that." Carol set the canceled check on the kitchen table and looked at the signature, C.E. Harlan, in blue ink. and thought about a morning she had been 11 years old and had come home from school to find her mother sitting at this same kitchen table, or the table that had preceded this one in the same position, and had been told about a stranger who had stopped at the foot of their porch steps and given everything back. She thought about what a farm was, not the acreage and the yield and the machinery, but the 30 years of mornings and the kitchen garden and her grandmother's name that her niece now carried, and the particular way the east field looked in October, when the corn was cut and the light came in flat and honest from the west. She thought about all of that as a thing that had nearly not existed. James Alderman had the canceled check framed sometime in the early 1990s. He was not sure of the exact year, but he knew his mother was still in the small house. So before 1994, when Ruth Alderman died in her sleep on a February morning at the age of 75, the frame was a plain dark wood frame, the kind sold at the hardware store, and James hung it in the hallway of the farmhouse between the kitchen and the front parlor, where people passed it going both directions several times a day. He put it at eye level, no label, no explanation. Anyone who lived in the house or knew the family knew what it was. Anyone who did not know could ask. Ruth Alderman's younger daughter, Patricia, who had come from Tama County for the funeral and helped James and Beverly sort through the small house, took the bank letter from the manila envelope and read it one more time and put it back. She gave the envelope to James, who put it in the drawer of the small desk in the farmhouse office, where it remained. The farmhouse, the barn, the machine shed, and what was now 140 acres of Black Hawk County bottomland passed to James Alderman upon Ruth's death, and then to his eldest son, Donald Alderman, in 2007, when James died at 66 of the same cardiac condition that had taken his father at 47, a fact that the family noted with a sorrow that was not without a kind of dark symmetry. Donald was 40 by then, farming the place the way his father had, with improvements and attention and the baseline seriousness of people who understand that the land does not accommodate inattention. Donald's youngest daughter, Ruth Alderman's great-granddaughter named Emma, born in 1989, wrote a paper for a local history class at the University of Northern Iowa in 2011 as a junior. The paper was about foreclosure practices in Black Hawk County during the post-war period and how they affected family farming operations. She used the bank letter and the county foreclosure records and interviews with several older residents of the county, including a woman named Irene Schuster's daughter, who had been 12 years old in 1958, and who remembered the morning of October 14th because her mother had come home from the Alderman place that afternoon and sat in the kitchen and did not say much, which in Irene Schuster was a reliable indicator of something significant. Emma Alderman's paper included a section on Cole Harlan. She had researched him through federal records, through newspaper archives in both Iowa and Arizona and New Mexico, through a brief correspondence with the Yuma County Historical Society, which had a small collection of material related to the marshal's service there. She found his obituary in the Albuquerque Journal. She found a photograph, a single photograph, reproduced from a group portrait of the Federal Marshal's Service Southwest District officers taken in 1961, in which he stood at the end of the back row, lean and dark-faced in a suit and tie, rather than the frontier dress that the format might have suggested, looking at the camera with the kind of expression that does not try to tell you anything more than the fact of his presence. She kept a copy of that photograph. The framed canceled check was still in the hallway of the farmhouse in Black Hawk County in 2011, when Emma went home for Thanksgiving, and her father Donald showed her a copy of the auction notice that had been filed with the county court in October of 1958, which he had obtained from the county clerk's records as a supplement to her research. The auction notice was typed on official county letterhead and described the property in its dry legal language, township, range, section, acreage, and gave the time and date of the auction and the name of the property owner, Ruth Alderman, widow, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Donald Alderman held it next to the framed check on the hallway wall, not formally displaying the notice but simply holding it up, and he and his daughter Emma stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the two documents side by side, the dry legal machinery of the thing that had nearly happened, and the signature in blue ink of the man who had made sure it didn't. Emma said, "Did he know, do you think? Did he know what it would amount to?" Donald said he doubted it. He said a man like that didn't do the arithmetic that way. He said you did what the situation required, and you left, and the rest of it was other people's business. He put the auction notice back in the office drawer with the bank letter in its manila envelope, and they went in to dinner. The east field was visible through the kitchen window in November light, bare and gray-brown and reaching east to the cottonwood line that had gone bare for the season. It was a good field. It had been a good field since Henry Alderman broke it in 1915, and had been a good field in all the years since, through the wet years and the dry years and the death of one man, and the near loss of everything, and the long recovery that followed. And it was a good field now, and it would be a good field in the springs to come, because a man in a gray coat had stopped his walking on a county road one October morning and read a crowd correctly and decided that what he was looking at required a decision. Some debts cannot be repaid, and the people who know this best are the ones who never tried to collect them.